Okay, everyone, good morning. Good morning from Indonesia and good afternoon in Australia. Welcome, everyone, in International Distance lecture on Public Administration with Mark Turner. My name is Agi Nugroho Sugiono. I'm one of the teaching staff of Department of Administration, Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Airlangga. Today, we will have sessions with Professor Mark Turner. He will be our adjunct professors in this year, and in this week, he will deliver 3 lectures with different themes that you can join tomorrow and Wednesday. Today's sessions, he will talk about aligning top-down with bottom-up planning. I believe this is a paper that he wrote. The paper he wrote in 2019. And today we will also have another speaker from Bappenas, which is Mrs. Septaliana Dewi Prananingtyas. I will introduce you to her later. Professor Mark Turner is a honorary professor at School of Business at UNSW, Canberra. He is also emeritus professor at University of Canberra. Okay, before I will begin this and give Prof Turner the sessions, I will explain some rules that we will have to obey here. Okay, this is the rules that you can read on your computer. So in this international distance lecture seminars, the participants are encouraged to first register yourself if you haven't, yeah. It's on the tinyurl.com/markturnerlecture. This is to ensure that everyone's attendance is recorded. The second one, you can activate your video and mute your microphone during lecture delivery. So make sure everyone is muted during the session. Dress up properly, and because we've got achieved the attendance from many institutions, not only from university, but also some institutions and minister in Indonesia and Malaysia. So therefore, please rename yourself with your real name and your institution. Okay, so your real name, after that your institution. So you can rename yourself, so we can identify you. During the Q&A session, please use the raise hand feature on the participant menu below. And you can use chat for assistance to host the meeting. Before we begin the presentation from Mark Turner, I will give the session to Dr. Sulika Asmorawati as our head of department to give his her welcoming speech. So, Mrs. Ika, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Agi. And I would like to welcome to Prof Mark Turner. It is really an honor to have you as our adjunct professor, Prof. So thank you very much on behalf of the department. We're really looking forward to work and collaborate with you in further time, online or hopefully on site next time, sometimes later in the year. We really appreciate your time and your availability for this guest lecture series. Again, we would like to thank you to Prof Mark Turner and all the participants who have been registered and joined this program. It is an honor for us. And hopefully, this seminar will benefit us all, especially in the time of pandemic. And hopefully, all of us can stay safe and healthy. That's all from me. Thank you very much. I'll give back to Agi Nugroho. Thank you, Agi.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sulika. Okay, I think some of you just joined the session, so I will give a quick explanation. Yeah. So today we will have 2 sessions. First, from Prof Turner, he will talk about aligning top-down with bottom-up planning, the case of Bhutan and Indonesia. And then the second presentation will be delivered by Mrs. Septaliana Dewi Prananingtyas. She is a regional development planner and she works for Bappenas. She will give presentation about adaptive planning in the time of COVID-19, going forward with the new normal. Okay, without further ado, I will give the session to Prof Turner to give his presentation. Prof, you can use the share screen feature.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be here in this online session, which I'm now getting used to, as all our teaching here in the University of New South Wales has gone online. So I've had to learn various new technologies in order to do this, and at my age that's often quite difficult. So although I can't hear you, I hope you're all there listening and able to hear me. And so what I'm going to do today is to talk about planning. To start with, I'm going to go into really a history of planning for development, where it all comes from and what forms it has taken and where it is today, before going on to give you an example of planning in Bhutan, which is a very small country in the Himalayas. For those who didn't know, I'll explain more of that later. And while you might say, well, that's a very small country of hardly anybody there, so what relevance is it to Indonesia? Well, one can always look for lessons from other places. So we shouldn't say size isn't the be all and end all. You can still learn lessons from this. And I studied the planning with one of my PhD students who's now graduated in Bhutan, and therefore I think it's a very good example of the general points I'm going to make today. Okay, so I sent some PowerPoints for you, and we start on the first one. We're going to start with the assertion, I'm going to make the assertion that effective planning can make a vital contribution to developmental success. If you have effective planning, you can have a much better chance of success in development, in economic growth, in improving welfare indicators. So the reverse side of that is, if you have poor planning, this can lead to very bad developmental results and very bad record of economic development and social development. Okay, well, what we're going to focus on today is two types of planning. The first one, which I'm going to call top-down, and the second one, which I'm going to call bottom-up. And I'm going to go through, first of all, to show you where they both originated from and how they were brought into practice, and then what the situation is today. So moving to the second PowerPoint, which is headed top-down planning, we can say that top-down planning characterized the early decades of development. So we're going back really into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and just into the 1980s. And top-down planning was from the national government, from the nation's capital, wherever you actually were. And it was manifested in national development plans. So countries had what they called national development plans. These haven't gone away, but I'll explain a little more about them later and the form they're in. And so these national development plans were detailed plans of what was going to happen in the economy and society, but especially the economy, over the following 5 or however many years. First country to make one of these plans was India in 1951. India had set up a very powerful planning commission, which wrote the first national development plan. And this national planning spread very rapidly from India to other places. So by the early 1980s, by probably about 1980-81, it was possible to count over 300 development plans, national development plans across the world. And so national development plans were the order of the day. This was how the newly independent developing countries of the world were going to move from a state of lacking development to becoming modern and developed. There was a lot of faith in that the national plans were the way to go. These were the maps for development, how it was going to happen. Okay, so why did these national plans come about? This is the third slide now, the inspiration for national plans. Well, there were various sources of inspiration for the national plans in developing countries. The first was the rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union through state planning. The Soviet Union had gone from being a predominantly rural and feudal society to being a major industrial power very rapidly, unprecedentedly rapidly. Nobody else had done it as fast. The way this had been done, though, was the important thing that people looked at. It was state planning. State planning planned the industrialization, planned the rapid industrialization. And countries in the developing world saw this example. Second one, to a lesser extent, was the wartime management in the UK during the Second World War. Because these national plans started coming, as I said, in 1951, 6 years after the Second World War ended. And wartime economic management was looked at, and people said, well, we managed to sort of shift production, up production levels, manage this, manage transport, manage this. We planned everything to make the maximum use of resources. And this was quite an impressive achievement. But more impressive was number 3, something called the Marshall Plan. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Europe was a mess. There was lots and lots of destruction. Whole cities had been destroyed. And so what was important, and we might think this is something which people will be thinking now about COVID-19, what was important was that economies should be rebuilt as rapidly as possible in Europe. So how is this going to happen? Well, there was a plan financed by the Americans, which was called the Marshall Plan, after the person who implemented it and supervised it. And this was a big success. A large amount of money was plowed into Europe for rebuilding Europe, and it was fast and it was successful, and economies came back very fast into production and higher production levels. So the Marshall Plan, again, people in developing countries said, look, they planned that rapid development in Europe. Why can't we plan rapid development in developing countries? And then finally, the intellectual climate. Well, if we looked at 2 things, management sciences and development economics, they both sort of said at this time, we've got the tools to make plans and make effective plans and engineer rapid socioeconomic development. So there's a great deal of confidence that the intellectual tools were also there from management science and especially from development economics. Okay, so far so good. Moving to the next next slide, which just to say, well, what did national plans have in them? And what you should do on your own here is to compare the national plans of today in Indonesia, and there are many, many plans, but the national plan, there's several national plans, what was in them, is it the same today? Well, the first thing about national plans back in the 60s and 70s was the stress on economic development goals. Economic development was the core of these plans, as distinct from social development, largely because there was an idea that with economic development, then all the social development would take place. What was often known as trickle down. Benefits would trickle down from economic growth. So all of the plans also had strategies to achieve economic goals. So they had the strategies of how you're going to get to achieve these ambitious plans. Then, number 3, internally consistent principles for operational implementation. Basically, they had clear guidelines for day-to-day decision-making. Okay? Then, number 4, they covered the whole economy. They tried to cover everything. They tried to cover everything in the economy and take account of that. How do you do that? Well, that's number 5. And that's the macroeconomic models. They use macroeconomic models used to predict performance. So they predicted cause and effect. If you do this, then that happens. So the idea there was you feed in data and say, here's some data. If we do this, what will happen? And so if you do X, then Y will happen. So it was used to predict performance. And they varied quite a bit from being simple to very sophisticated and only operable by some very highly trained technocrats, but not the vast majority of public servants or even planners. Typically, they were 5 years in duration, what we refer to as medium term. And then finally, I've said they're elitist. They didn't involve consultation, perhaps with some other elites, perhaps, but largely they were the product of technocrats, technically qualified bureaucrats in the planning commissions and planning ministries. They were the ones who produced these plans because they had the technical skills needed for the macroeconomic modeling and the other technical issues that needed to be covered. Okay, moving on to the next one. So that's the national plans, but we move on to the problems. Now, despite all this optimism that things were going to get much better and very rapidly, and also because of the, we would say, the technical assurance, the confidence that planners had, but they didn't produce the results. They rarely did. You do have some places where they did, maybe amongst the Asian tigers, maybe amongst when you look at places like Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore, South Korea, maybe. But generally, no, they didn't produce the results. They didn't produce the rapid development. What you got was a series of problems were found. First of all, they were wildly overambitious. The plans were going to achieve much more than was really possible. That they'd left what I might call their senses behind, and they'd said, we can do this, we can do that. And really, they were just too ambitious. Many of them had goals which were supposed to be achieved, which in retrospect, in looking back, we can say, no, they had no chance of being achieved. The second thing is planning, or good planning, effective planning, relies on good data. Good data given in reliable data and given in a timely manner. So reliable and in a timely manner. For instance, if you've got reliable data, but it doesn't come to you for a few years, then it's not much use for planning. If you've got timely data, but it's not very good, it may not be very accurate, then that's not good for planning. So at this time, there were, in many countries, of very poor databases, data collection there, and the quality of data was lacking, what existed. The third thing is, for this, I'll go to organizational theory to explain this one. The item is failed to grasp complexity. So all organizations exist in environments, and the organization interacts with the environment. The organization is trying in some ways to change the environment through its activities. So in this case, it's to develop rapidly. Well, what happened was that the planners, while confident, did not really grasp the complexity of the environment in which they operated. They just didn't understand, and indeed it's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand all the relationships and the changing relationships, because the environment is not static. It's changing all the time. And so this leads us to number 4 of the planners weren't prepared for the shocks. That when you get a shock in the environment, so a typical shock might be oil price hikes. So an oil shock, the price of oil goes through the roof. So that's a shock. How do you accommodate that in your plan if suddenly the cost of doing business goes very, very high rapidly? Similarly, natural disasters that occur. Also, maybe civil strife, maybe civil war even. So these plans were made to be in stable environments, but anything but stable environments were there. Now, the planners themselves, they tended to be there sort of away in planning commissions, ministries of planning. They were distant figures, distant from the society in which they operated. They operated in a sort of isolation from the society. And this was very problematic for implementation, because it meant that planners could make plans which those who implemented them knew were not feasible. They knew they couldn't be done. They knew that these were very difficult to achieve. And the final one is that the planning, national planning, this top-down planning, didn't take into account politics. Yet one should always, always, always take into account politics when you're dealing with decision-making. Decision-making is sometimes seen to be a rational process. That is, we can easily calculate the results of what we do. Just gave an example of this before. Rationality, in this case, rational decision-making, is saying, if we do X, then Y will happen, and you can predict it precisely. Well, one of the things about planning is that it's influenced by politics. And politics is often about people pursuing, well, mostly about people pursuing self-interest, sectional interests. So what we've got there is that politics, and the politics affects the decision-making. And it's not simply technical matter. And sometimes this is overlooked, and still today I encounter it in work that I do and have done, is a faith in some aspects of planning which doesn't take into account the nature of political influences on the decision-making process. And that is in countries I work in, and the same here in Australia as well. Okay, so that's the problems of national plans. So we might say, well, if all those things were going wrong with it, go to the next slide, we say, what happened to them? So did it just die a death? Did it sort of cease to exist? Well, no, it didn't. It stayed. So national planning stayed, but not in the form that it was before. So as I've said there, it persisted, and countries have national plans, but they became more, should we say, diluted in the sense of less confident in predicting the details of what was going to happen and how it was going to happen. And they became generally more realistic about what you could actually put into a plan, what you could hope to achieve. And so perhaps, as the next point there says, government still needed to give overall direction to the economy. So this is where planning sort of went to, the idea of giving an overall direction, but not giving lots of numerical targets and measures that were going to be achieved on this, that, and the other. The precision, which was always, not feasible, not probable. So what you've got is overall direction now, which is a thing which you find in national development plans. And they were given a boost in the late 1990s. So they went out of fashion in the late 1980s and in the early 90s. This is in part, as you may appreciate, due to the rise of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, of course, argues about the superiority of market forces, that the market is a much better allocator of resources. And so if you rely on the market, not on plans, because plans mess up the market, plans mess things up. They're incorrect, they distort markets. So in the late 1990s, there was a comeback on national planning because the international financial institutions, IFI stands for International Financial Institution and refers to IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, those sorts of institutions. They wanted, for giving loans, especially strategic adjustment loans, poverty reduction strategies from countries. And these were, in fact, national plans. And so we have the IFI demand for poverty reduction strategies revitalized national planning. Okay, so we move to the next slide and we get on to bottom-up planning. So the early efforts of bottom-up planning were often unsuccessful. Bottom-up planning, as the name suggests, means you're starting at the grassroots. You're starting with the community. You're starting in the villages. You're starting out there with the people. Okay, so the early ones, and these were happening in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, were often unsuccessful. For example, the community development movement, which started in India and was very promising to start with, became highly bureaucratized and eventually really sort of failed. Cooperatives in many countries often fail there. So the early efforts were often unsuccessful. But also, what's something which is called a rational project cycle also disappointed as well. Now, I've got on the next slide, I have the actual diagram of the cycle, the project cycle. And this was used for project planning at the local level. Thank you. And you can see, I'll briefly go through this. This is also called the rational decision-making model, and you'll find it in policy studies as well as planning. So what you go from, starting at the top, is identification. You identify what you want to do a project on, what the activity is. Next stage, well, in order to plan, you need data. So you go and collect data. You get the raw material for planning. Right, next, you've got the raw material. So what you have to do is analyze it. You analyze the raw material to tease out of it, to get from it what the project should be, what should the one that works, what is the best possible use of the resources, and you prepare the project. You then move on to appraising the project, going through the project, that is, and saying, you know, how is this? Does this work? Is this sensible? Is this okay? And select it. You maybe make some modifications as well. You then go on and implement it. This has always been a big problem box in this diagram because it just assumes implementation will happen, that it's in the project plan, so the project plan says this, and it'll just be implemented just like that. Now, this is a subject on its own, and one which I've had much experience of because I've done a lot of consulting work in Asia and the Pacific, and often sort of on implementation of plans. Okay, you go from the implementation, then you evaluate the plan. The evaluation, what's happened and why. And so you look at that, and then you feed back that knowledge into the project cycle, and you feed it back into the identification of new projects. All sounds very neat, all sounds very tidy, but not quite as easy as all that. So if we say, back to the previous slide, on bottom-up planning on the rise, the problem with using that project cycle was you often have ill-structured problems. For example, an ill-structured problem, or sometimes called wicked problems, are things like poverty. Poverty is not a well-structured. It's not something simple, straightforward that you can actually encapsulate in easy terms. So you've got ill-structured problems. You have poor data, which we've already said. Uncertainty in the environment in which you're operating, that it's changing all the time. It's subject to shocks. Things are happening it's unpredictable in some ways. And then a separation of preparation from planning from management. And that's the business of planning from the implementation of the plan. And then the lack of beneficiary participation, because this early sort of project planning was still very much done by public servants. There was an assumption of superior knowledge, modern Western knowledge often, because that's where these models came from. And so there was a lack of, even though it was projects for down at the grassroots level, often there was a lack of beneficiary participation. And again, ignoring the political factors. So if we move on now to the, I think the final, the bottom-up planning. And again, if we move on one more slide, bottom-up planning. So this led to experimentation with new forms of bottom-up planning and a whole variety of new methodologies, planning methodologies came out. And these ones that I've listed here are very much the basis of a whole range of participatory planning methodologies, bottom-up planning methodologies, which we see practiced today. The first was the learning process approach by Corton. Again, you started at the grassroots. Adaptive administration, this was one where you start with an experiment, and then you gradually try out your experiment. and then you use local knowledge. It's on a small scale, but you gradually build up and then replicate as you can as you get the model better refined. Participatory rural appraisal, where the stress was put on popular community involvement, if not direction of the process. Similarly, participatory learning and action. And then we have social accountability mechanisms, such as citizens' juries, where you have citizens who look at what the local government is doing with the budget, and as a jury looking at whether they think that's good expenditure or not. Citizen scorecards. These are scorecards where you rate the quality of the service you are receiving. Whatever the service is, you can do a scorecard for it. Client charters. These establish levels of service that you should be able to expect from your service providers. And participatory budgeting, where the budget for development comes, and this was pioneered in Brazil, where the budget for development comes upwards. It starts right at the bottom in the different wards, different areas of the city, and citizens can all participate, and their choices are gradually are passed upwards and then sorted through and eventually presented to the city government. Okay, so what you had was a lot of different methodologies, and if we turn over to the next slide, what we can say, what they generally involve, so we can say that they generally involve participation at the grassroots. So participation in various ways at the grassroots. They involve learning from experience. So we learn from experience, and we experiment. Experimentation is common, and even though this is upwards, you get to a point where support from the government is often required. So just take a drink for a moment. So support from the government is often required. The government has finance, the government has human resources, the government has expertise, things which are needed by the people at the local community level because they don't have those resources. So if, incidentally, there has been criticism of these approaches, some authors and researchers say, well, has all that participation actually taken place? Or is it the public servants? Is it the Asian Development Bank sort of people? Is it even the NGOs who are directing what's happening? So there has been criticism of this. Right, that gives you a background of where sort of planning, the history of what has happened. What I'd briefly like to do now, because I'm aware that time is moving on quite rapidly, is just to say there's a variety of, I'd move on to talking about Bhutan, okay? So top down, and this is an example. Why this is good is because it shows how you can combine the two successfully. So this is a success story of planning. Okay, so as I said, you can see there, located up in the Himalayas, population of 750,000, sustained economic, it's had a history or recent history of sustained economic growth, because we only started with modernizing the society and economy in the 1960s, but there's been significant welfare improvements, life expectancy, education levels, health levels, poverty alleviation, and it's gone from being a very poor country, very, very poor country, to becoming now a lower middle income country. And what I would say for the next slide is that it has been in part, or maybe even in large part, I go a bit further, that its planning has been very important in the success story of Bhutan. Okay, now you can see there on the map where it is. It's bordered on the north by China and on the south by India. So the two biggest countries in the world and one of the smallest countries in the world sandwiched in between. Bhutan works on a development philosophy called gross national happiness. This phrase was invented by the fourth king in 1972 and was then, over the years, transformed into a coherent development philosophy and how you practice development. So it came from a comment where he said, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, indicating that he thought that too much emphasis was being placed on the economy and not enough more generally on the whole, all aspects of development, that it was a much more holistic thing. And so, as I say, they've now moved to, it became a philosophy and a practice, and it guides all government activity, including national economic planning. And you can see there on the slide that what are the 4 pillars of it? Well, sustainable and equitable socioeconomic development. So the economic development is still there. Environmental conservation, preservation and promotion of culture, and good governance. Now, those things, when you have your planning, you must take into account all of those things. So, if we move to the next slide of the development in planning in Bhutan, we have, you find socioeconomic development only began in the 1960s. It was an isolated kingdom up there, difficult to access, virtually no one went there. There was no infrastructure almost at all, and certainly no concrete roads or anything like that. And it's a very difficult country to get around, that's for sure. And then they decided to modernize, and the first 5-year plan, 61 to 66, but they had no planners at all, very few public servants even. And so this was designed by Indian officials who were loaned to the government of Bhutan. Well, we're now on the 12th 5-year plan, 2018 to 2023. But as well as the top-down 5-year plans, we also from the 1980s started to get bottom-up planning with district development committees. The country is divided into districts. That'd be the equivalent of Kabupaten or Kota would be a district. So these started bottom-up development plans. Obviously, the numbers of people who live in the districts in Bhutan, the Kabupaten equivalents, are nowhere near the numbers who live in a Kabupaten in Indonesia. That's for sure. Much lower numbers. Okay, moving to the next one, because I'm again conscious of needing to speed up a little bit here. That was the photograph, I should say, was the place I went to teach public servants at. Very beautiful valley, high in the Himalayas. Okay, so the planning structure, you have 3 levels, and what you have at the top is the national level, and an organization, the equivalent of Bapanas, which is the Gross National Happiness Commission, so the GNHC as it's called, and the cabinet of the elected government. So again, so that's the national level. They're the important actors. This commission, which is really the planning commission, the GNHC, and the cabinet, which is the cabinet of the government. Then the next territorial level down is the district, called it Dzongkhag, And there you have a district committee, which is elected, and a district administration, which are public servants. So this is the principal subdivision. And then going to the bottom level, which would be the equivalent of the desa, we get down to the Gewog. And these are small communities, very small communities sometimes, possibly even down to even 2,000 or something like that in some places where you get to remoter areas. And there you have the committee, community committee, elected, and then the administration. This will be very few people, but they again will be public servants. So 3 levels. In some ways has similarities to Indonesia in this. So what actually happens? I'll briefly take you to show you how bottom up and top down meet in this process, but I'll do this very briefly, and I'll just do it for the district planning process. Okay, so the first thing is, and I'll just go through this quite rapidly. The GNHCS, that's the Gross National Happiness Commission Secretariat. Those are the public servants. They work with the stakeholders, so the district, to, well, actually all stakeholders, to develop planning guidelines for the 5-year plans and for the local governments. So they develop the guidelines of how you're going to do your local government plan, your Zonkag, your district plan. Then they say, right, let's allocate the fund, and they also, the GNHCS, the national level, will provide training on how you do planning to the district level public servants and elected members. So they take responsibility for that, so they know what they're doing. Secondly, there's a certain amount of funds allocated to each district, and so there's a formula which happens in many countries, and I think Indonesia as well. So it's formulas for resources. It happens in the Philippines, which I know as well. And so population, poverty, size, transport costs are the indicators and how they measure those. Then what we get onto the planning itself. The district administration officials identify and prioritize plan activities in consultation with the community. There are lots of meetings with the community, with their representatives, about what is going to be included in the plan. And the district admin officials, that is the public servants, are the ones who put it all together. So they coordinate this. Then the elected officials at the district level, so at the district level, so this is it. So they review the plan that has been put together by the officials, by the administrators, from the feedback, from the ideas from the community, and then they review it and endorse the plan. Moving on to the implementation of it, the district plan is then submitted to the national level and then gets feedback from the ministries before cabinet approval. Because what they have to do in the planning system is to make sure it's aligned with national priorities. So making sure it's aligned with national priorities. Then you sort of have the annual plan budget is proposed to the Ministry of Finance for approval. And then once you've got the budget, then the tender committee of district administration officials awards contracts. If for any activity, you must have community permission. So you want to build something somewhere, the community in that place must approve of that. There is monitoring, of course, by both central and local officials, and then a terminal review after 5 years, fed back into the new 5-year plan. Okay, I won't go into the Gewog planning process. Just say a few words on top-down and bottom-up planning in Bhutan, just there. So just a few observations. It's been a success. It's been a success in Bhutan, using this top-down and bottom-up in terms of outputs and outcomes. It has produced the development goods. It has produced the rapid development, the economic growth, the improvement in social indicators. So it's been a success in terms of outputs and outcomes. It has been the means by which the development philosophy of the country has been pursued. And so it is planning based on these principles, and it's efficient. The number 3, it's efficient at all levels. People understand the system, and officers, people understand the system, and officials know what to do and how to do it. And there is support and perhaps instruction by the National Planning Office, the GNHCS. Decentralized actors down to the very grassroots, to the village level, have their voices heard and acted on. They get their projects there. But you have to say that the central guidance still dominates. So central guidance, the top down, is still very much in evidence in a system that combines top down and bottom up. So if we just, for the final 5 minutes, I've been asked to make a few observations on planning in Indonesia. And what I'll say on the, now the first thing I must say, I'm no expert on planning in Indonesia. My work has been in Indonesia has generally been concerned with decentralization right from 1999, and also bureaucracy reform. So mine is more on that. And so I've never actually done work on planning, focusing on planning, although obviously I've sort of encountered planning. Fine, just a few things. What has happened in Indonesia? To me, it seems like we've gone from a highly centralized system under the new order, one controlled by Bappenas, to a more mixed one. So under the new order, it was a highly centralized system with Bappenas as a very powerful agency, to now one which is a more mixed form of, it's also, sorry, yeah, and the centralization of it was also sort of remarkable, to a more mixed one. Why is this? Well, democratization and decentralization. This has meant you're giving out power, authority to subnational territories. The governments of subnational territories didn't have these authorities, powers, and resources before. So, as I say there, districts, the Kabupaten and the Kota especially, have authority over many functions and resources previously controlled by ministries and their deconcentrated offices. Deconcentration meaning that the control in the past in the new order was with the ministries, and they passed down authority to their offices in the Kabupaten. Okay, but now with decentralization and democratization, districts have had to take on major roles in planning. They've had to. And now, in the sort of more recently, villages have also been awarded substantial funds and must plan for the expenditure of these funds. So we moved from highly centralized to, again, a mixture. So just having a few observations on the next one, on the system in Indonesia. There are similarities with Bhutan, I think, in that there is both top-down and bottom-up. Probably the bottom-up isn't as pronounced if we take the grassroots, maybe not, as Bhutan, but certainly you can see similarities in both top-down and bottom-up planning. Now, there you should know all of this stuff, that there's a national long-term development plan. This is one, the vision of the future over 20 years. This is accompanied by the standard medium-term 5-year development plan. And then there's also this Additional plan these days came in 2011, the Master Plan for Acceleration and Expansion of Indonesia's Economic Development. This perhaps is representative of the emphasis given to economic development in contemporary Indonesian planning. Now, again, like Bhutan, these plans set the directions. They provide the direction at the national level, and other government agencies and territorial governments set their priorities, their own priorities, but these should be aligned with the national plans. I was going to say something about the priority setting, but there's not enough time. Moving on, I'll gloss over. This is one, you'll know this there, that there's the plan and the map of this plan. Now, just the final slide. Okay, I've taken some selected issues. I've taken them for planning in Indonesia, and I've taken them at a general level. Some of them reflect some of my experiences in Indonesia and elsewhere in Asia and the Pacific. Okay, coordination. Problems of Indonesia has problems of coordination right from the start, because it's such a large country, so many agencies, so many territorial divisions, that coordination is difficult. So the sheer size makes up for problems in coordination. But also, perhaps not from the size, but in Indonesia, it's clear that bureaucracy as a form of organization, not as a description of the public service, bureaucratic forms of organization still predominate, and they're not good at coordination between each other. For instance, we have had for many years in Australia and elsewhere things that we call joined up government and whole of government, where you get cooperation and collaboration between government agencies, between different levels of government. This whole of government, joined up government, is something which is much harder to achieve in Indonesia. Capacity. Capacity, you need capacity for planning. You need people who understand it, know how to do it. This may be a problem, well, is a problem in perhaps remoter areas. Some of the kabupaten maybe have sort of problems of capacity. Even at central level, you can have problems of capacity as new methods, techniques take over, and people who are working in these agencies may not have absorbed, learned these new techniques, may be resistant to them even. So capacity, the capacity to be able to do the planning job. The third thing is alignment. Now, this is a much used word, and as you saw in Bhutan and in Indonesia, plans are supposed to be aligned with the national 20-year and the national 5-year plan. It's sometimes very difficult to keep track of this alignment. It's also what exactly, when is something aligned and when is it not? This is sort of very difficult. How do we know it's aligned? How do we measure whether it's aligned? Do we? Is the pressure to pursue alternative visions of development? So alignment is a difficult thing. Then voice. Voice is supposed to be reflected in planning, and at the local level, Musrembang in Indonesia, you have right down at the grassroots, also the idea that kabupaten governments, that the Bupati and his executive should be conferring with the elected representatives in the DPRD, and also with other interest groups, with NGOs. So the question always is, how far is this taking place? I know examples where it's very good and you have good records of this, but there's other places where maybe this isn't happening. And some studies I've seen of village level planning have been critical of the nature of the participation, saying that it is often weak popular participation. Accountability is a problem for many countries. In Bhutan, in actual fact, it isn't, because they have a very low incidence of corruption. Unfortunately, in Indonesia, while there have been steps taken and advances made, there's still problems of accountability, still problems of corruption. Procurement, of course, always is the sort of area where accountability is tested the most. And finally, implementation. I say that it's a long-standing and understated area of difficulty. There can be major problems of translating plans into action. Its difficulty is underestimated, and just because you have a plan document, it does not mean it will be implemented successfully. Okay, and so I think I better finish there. I've gone over time a bit, but I hope that has been interesting for you.
Thank you, Prof. Turner, for the insightful presentations. I've noticed several coverage on bottom-up and top-down planning approach, which your argument says that it can be successfully combined into effective and efficient. In the case of Bhutan, you mentioned several systems that are quite similar with Indonesians. However, in Indonesian system in planning, there are a few observations, according to you, that have been need more to address, yeah, such as coordination, capacity, alignment, voice, accountability, implementations. Okay, we will move to the next speaker. I believe she's already in this room. Let me check the participants.
Yeah, ready.
Okay, Mrs. Septaliana, Ibu Septa.
Yes, saya dipanggil Lia aja, Mas.
Oh,
just
okay.
call me Lia. Yeah, my name is too
Welcome
long.
ya,
So.
Bu Lia.
Thank
Welcome,
you.
Bu Lia.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I will introduce to everybody with Bu Lia here. So Bu Lia works for Bappenas, a National Development Planning Agency. She graduated from Universitas Gadjah Mada in Economics and Development. She took masters in Monash University from Business and Economics, and she's currently studying at RMIT University, Australia, for Urban and Social Studies. I believe the presenters here are all from Australian University, yeah? Prof Mark Turner, Bu Lia, and also Bu Ika also graduated from Australia. Okay, she will present about adaptive planning, Bu, yeah, in regards to COVID-19 pandemic. And also, I've noticed from the participants that this room is limited for 100. I'm so sorry, but we will manage to get higher participants tomorrow. However, this meeting is already recorded, so I will upload it to platform like YouTube, so everyone can access it later. So I will give the session to Ma'am Lia. The time is yours, Bu.
Yeah, okay. So let me just share my presentation. I hope I correctly share it. Okay.
Okay, works well, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh.
Yes, did it.
Wait a minute. Sorry. Bear with me. Okay.
Next, we are patient here.
Yeah, sorry. I think I shared the wrong file.
Hanya 15 kebutuhannya cuma 6 aja.
Mute all ya Pak Agi.
Dari yang mana yang satu?
Okay.
While waiting for the file ready, I would like to also thank you for UITM Kedah who has joined us today, yeah, from the University Teknologi Mara, who is joining us in this lecture. Thank you very much, Bu Junaida, Dr. Junaida, and of course all other participants for keep in this lecture. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving me time to upload, to share the screen. Okay. So my presentation is like an extension of Professor Turner's explanation about planning, and my presentation would be a more of the practitioner side of the story of planning in Indonesia. So basically, I'm going to present three things in this presentation. The first is the current planning system in Indonesia. So I'm from the Regional Development Unit in Bappenas, which basically is the unit that handles the, as Professor Turner explained, Musrenbang, Musyawarah Pembangunan Nasional, and also in the local area, which is in daerah. And then the second aspect that I would like to present is the regional planning and the COVID-19 challenges. So as from the previous presentation by Professor Turner, he also explained that in planning, sometimes there are shocks. And I think this COVID-19 issue or challenge is a shock that we could learn from the point of view of planning. And the third is briefly, I'm just going to explain what adapting with the new normal is and the directions of the government of Indonesia. So in the Indonesian planning system, there is the long-term plan, the medium-term plan, and the annual-term plan. So the long-term plan is the 20 years, and the medium is the 5 years, and the national is the annual is the yearly one. And basically, these planning documents have national development priorities in them that will be translated into programs and then development actions. But with decentralization, regions also have this own planning system that reflects similar to the national planning system, which they identify their own local development priorities, and then they will translate it in their long-term, medium-term, and annual planning. And so the next question would be that how is the national and the local planning documents or plans be combined? So top down and bottom up combination. We use the Musrenbang, which is the Musyawarah Perencanaan Pembangunan, or the what do you say in English? It's kind of a based on network interactions or discussions between development stakeholders in the national and also from the local area. So if there's a bit of an illustration, so if we have the national planning documents, and we have the annual one, which we do every year. We draft this annual plan with inputs from the local area. So the community Musrenbang is done. They do it early before the national does it. So first the villages, and then the kabupatens, and then the provincial, then all these planning priorities in the local areas is brought up in the national plan when we meet the provincial. So how it goes is that the kabupatens go to the provincial, and there's a provincial musrenbang, and then the provincial goes to the national and they do the national musrenbang. Now this is a bit technical and I'm sorry I haven't really translated all the presentations, but how the provincial level makes their annual plan, for example, is that they look at the national priority and they also look at the provincial priority, and they try to combine how they are going to contribute to the national priority. And they also look at the evaluation of the RPG in the local area. And then because planning, as Professor Turner said, is very political. So like the national plan documents, we look at the political visions of the president. And in the local area, it's the same, where the planning documents look at the local head directives and also the economic macro structure and local aspirations. And from the priorities, the local areas have targets. They provide targets in the documents to achieve. And also we don't forget that there's a technocratic process in it and there's a political process in it as well. So that is also a challenge in the planning process. This is just a more specific. I will not go into detail in this one, but you can see that there's a aspirasi camat. So it's the aspirations of local village heads. So it's that detail. What we hope for is that we can get information in that level of detail. So hoping that the bottom-up approach is can be well executed. Okay, and so how is regional development planning with COVID-19? So from this is the national concerns or national data that we use. We look at the impact of COVID-19, the risk of COVID-19, and from those two things, we have scenarios post-COVID-19. So currently, Bappenas is, after the announcement of the large-scale social distancing by the president, we focus on the recovery aspect of COVID-19. So we don't really focus anymore on how to have a social distancing, but that is for another institution to think. But for Bappenas, we think of more of how to recover after this COVID-19 is going, the curve goes down. So the impact, we understand that there's human fatality, there's gonna be a socio-economic impact, and there will be changes in human behavior. And the risk of those impacts will be economic recessions, changes and shift in planning. So this is where the adaptive planning thing comes into. And there's gonna be fiscal policy changes, and we should understand the optimizing of technology and science to face the challenges of COVID-19. So there's three scenarios that we think of. There's the exponential rebound, which is what we really hope will happen, that we plunge down, but then we hope that we can really recover quickly. But there's also the moderate scenario where, okay, we rebound, but not as quickly as the previous scenario. Now this third scenario is not what we want, which is we fall into recession. So what's the impact of COVID-19 towards the domestic economy? Well, this is just a very simple, and some of you may think very oversimplified formula of looking at the economy, where it consists of consumption, government, community consumption, government consumption, investment, export, and imports. But if we break down through these variables, where the household will obviously lose income and have decrease of consumption, but there's going to be price increase, and the small scale industries will also suffer with the demand and supply, and bankruptcy, redundancy, and the government will have decrease in income, but they need to increase the government expenditure for social security and health capacity, increasing health capacity. Financial institution, that's clear, where there's not just for Indonesia, the global is in the volatility of the global financial situation is in trouble. And then the rest of the world, of course, Indonesia is an open country, so what happens to the other countries will also affect Indonesia. So what we need is, while waiting for the vaccine, even if that works, there's another scenario that the vaccine might not work. So we need to find the combination of still having social or physical distancing, but also not jeopardize the economy. Okay, so Indonesia, for the large scale social distancing, Indonesia has several regulations. So the first is the PP or Peraturan Pemerintah number 21/2020, where the central government state the need to do the large scale social distancing. And then there's the Perpu or Peraturan Pengganti Undang-Undang, so a regulation that replaces law 1/2020 to handle the fiscal policy and stability. But there's also the Permenkes, which is the regulation from the health minister, number 9/2020, on regional social distancing. From the three, this is very important and related to decentralizations. Regions or regional governments are expected to independently handle what COVID-19 impact on their areas. The other is just more of a, this is significant to the central government budget allocations. So there's change in deficits, there's budget reallocation and refocusing, budget allocations in regions, which is important, and increased budget for health and management, and there is also budget policy for COVID-19. So this is just the president direction. So one of them is on local budget refocusing. So it is a concern in the national area, but still, the central government really believe that local areas are the ones that know their area more than the central government. So what they need to do in terms of COVID, they understand it more than the central government. So the central government focuses on more of national social safety net and business stimulus for businesses, and also thinking of the 2021 economic impact of the failed targets of 2020. So that's what are the main concerns. So adapting with the new normal. So Bappenas, as the planning agency, understands that we cannot have development priorities the same as before COVID-19. We cannot aim for targets that is the same before COVID-19. And as a regional, me working in the regional development unit, our unit understands that local areas will have to change also in terms of the COVID-19 challenges. So the central government have a four-phase economic, four-phase recovery. So with the COVID-19, it's interesting because while there are negative or devastating impacts on countries, but for Indonesia, we try to kind of gain what does this teach us. So it's this pandemic, we understand that we need to improve our health facility. It's not impossible that in 20 years there's going to be something similar to COVID-19 again. So we can learn from this pandemic. So besides the current planning or the current steps that we need to take, for example, there's going to be new health measurements and social distancing procedures, but we need to increase our capacity in labs and health services and health people or health labor, and health labor safety. We need to think about that, and this government will last till 2024, but nearing maybe in year 2023 we will be thinking about the next medium plan. So that will definitely be put in the next RPDM. So the second phase is the social protecting the vulnerable groups. There's two vulnerable groups. There's the communities, and there's also the small businesses. And both are very important for our economy. So for the communities, there's the social safety nets, and for the businesses, there's tax incentives and recovery plans. And the third phase is the decreasing the financial sector pressure. So that's like fiscal and monetary stimuli and liquidity assistance. And for the next phase is the economic recovery pause. So what I explained before, that we are focusing on this part because the first phase until the third phase is already ongoing. And the fourth phase is everything that we have or programs is focused on this aspect. Now, what about the local areas? What do we expect for them from the local areas? So virus spreads, this is definitely something current and important for us, although still, as I want to underline, that the central government expect the local government to take lead of their areas. So how do they tighten their social distancing? How do they optimize the role of RT/RW? It's like a the neighborhoods, and with the Ramadan and Idul Fitri, there's the mudik issue, and I think in the media is very interesting debates on that issue. And how are they going to continue with the social distancing, the large-scale social distancing, and how are they going to increase their health facility and capacity? And then this is important because the local budgets needs refocusing. So what's the refocusing? It's optimizing the 2020 budgets, but also really look into mitigating the impact of COVID-19 in the 2021 budgets. And the second is to encourage the village governments to optimize the village funds for COVID-19, particularly for surveillance, because in the village level is where we can see what's really going on in the area, how the people are interacting, how people are suffering. And the third is the non-government participation. So we know that I think Indonesia was ranked the most volunteers, or I think empathy toward others with the COVID-19, how people help other people help their neighbors. So what we really would like to see is that that these efforts from the community is also aligned with the efforts from the local government and national government. The third is the local economic, and agriculture is very important in terms of food security. So that is because currently with other countries also experiencing the pandemic, we need to be more independent in our food. And we also understand Indonesia is a country with tourism sector as a very big sector that have a very big proportion in the economy. So how can we revitalize tourism in the local area while still paying attention to the health measures and social distancing? And also we would want to see in the local area how local small businesses can be given capital stimulus and other incentives that will help them post COVID-19, and how the local products can survive in this pandemic. Well, for example, we know that exports is also hard because other countries are not thinking about spending money to buy other products from other countries. So how can we make cooperations, for example, with between local areas, or to provide the products that other local areas don't have, but that local area has. So it's kind of a strengthening the economy domestically. And also we know that there is a lot of non-formal sectors in Indonesia. So for example, labor are non-formal. That's a bit difficult to identify, but with we really hope that with the lowest level of governance, the RT/RW, the neighborhood, we can identify those non-formal sectors. Last but not least, the society basic needs. We know that there are people that are very vulnerable that we have to guarantee social subsidies or social help for them. And for these vulnerable people, we also need to guarantee their food security. And because in COVID-19, even the ones that aren't poor before become poor. So what of the ones that are poor before? So we need to also take account of that, particularly the local area. So in the first steps is that they need to provide reliable data of those people, the poor, the vulnerable poor, and etc. And not to forget, because corruption is very probable in this situation. We don't know, so that's why we need to monitor closely how these funds, these social schemes really is received with the people that need them. And the fifth is how to still guarantee trade or guarantee the economy trade in the local area. For example, make everything traditional markets to be online, facilitate those kind of moves from the local government to the society. And that's the end of my presentation. I really hope there will be more discussions, and this is just a big outline of what currently is occurring from the point of view of the central government, particularly Bappenas. And I'm also open to questions if you want to ask about Bappenas as well, and the role of regional development and local areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bulia, can everyone give applause to both speakers? Claps online. Okay, Bulia has covered many issues here regarding how Indonesian will flatten the curve, and then she mentions several phases that can be done from the central and also local governments, including there are also interesting curve V, Ln, the tree-driven curve that probably will happen in Indonesia. So maybe I will give to the participants whether they have questions. Please use the raise hand feature. Okay, everybody has a questions. Okay, Saskia.
All right, thank you. I'm so
Saskia
sorry.
and Sugeng Danzo, okay? Saskia and Danzo.
All
And
right, so I'm
Bu Isna,
sorry.
Bu Isna,
Okay.
Bu Isna is the third, okay? Okay.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry I couldn't turn on my laptop camera for some reasons. And anyway, it's really nice to have our speakers today. My name is Saskia and I'm a third-year student from the Department of Public Administration. And I have a question to ask to Professor Turner. So I think the story of Bhutan is indeed very interesting, but I'm particularly interested in the case of the Asian tiger, as you briefly mentioned. And in spite of the general disappointments over the performance of a top-down national planning, there were some notable exceptions, including those 4 countries, for instance. And so far, the only explanation that I could come up with is just cultural factors. So I'd like to hear your views on it. Why do you think a national top-down planning is relatively successful in those tiger countries compared to their Asian counterparts? Okay, that's from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Saskia, for the questions. Maybe the next one is Sugeng Danzo. Danzo, you can turn on your microphone.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, presenters. Your presentations are well noted, and I'm glad to get your insight about the top-down and bottom-up approach. My question to Professor Mark Turner is about, he said planning is somehow political. I don't know, I don't understand what he means by planning is. I'm thinking that planning is more professional than political. And also to the second presenter, if you look at Indonesia, like most of the SMEs are badly affected with this COVID-19. Does government have any relief package for the COVID-19 for these SMEs, that is small medium enterprises in Indonesia, especially in Surabaya? Do they have any relief package for SMEs? Because if you look at the most restaurants are closed, and most of the shops are closed. 2 days ago, I was at a high-tech mall. You know, almost I can say 70% of the shops are closed. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, thank you very much, Danzo. The questions will be directed to presenters. And the next one is Bu Isna.
Yes, thank you, Mas Adi. Hello, thank you from the material. It's good material. My question is for Mark. It's a little bit theoretical. I mean, I ask you the common thread between adaptive planning versus planning that changes frequently, or we say plain plan, plain plan, or keep changing, always change the plan. Not adaptive, but change the plan, what condition. Because I'm sorry, Bulia. In our government is so many they are doing change not adaptive. If I see that, thank you. That's my question for Mark. It is theoretical, I think. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Bu Lika.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will give to Professor Mark Turner about the questions. You've got 3 questions. First of all, about the Asian tiger in regards to top-down planning. Second one, Danso questions about the political aspect in planning. And Bu Isna in regards to theoretical aspect of adaptive planning that is always frequently changing. It's not it's not always changing. It's that because everybody's confused about the plan from the government. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your questions. I'll go through them in order. First of all, why were the tiger economies successful? And was it culture? Well, culture may be a bit of the answer in my view, but in the sense that you have greater ideas of collectivism and unity, perhaps in Asian societies, less individualism. But it's only, I think, a small part of the explanation. The first with, and I'll take South Korea because South Korea has been the most remarkable story of the lot. Because South Korea emerged from a devastating war, which it was really, really one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world. Its GDP per capita was below that of, say, the Philippines and many other Asian countries. However, it succeeded in the space of 4 decades or 4 decades of becoming an OECD country. Right. One of the sort of first things was clear policy about what was intended. They knew exactly what they wanted to do. Also, there were technocrats in charge of this who didn't have to worry about the politics of planning so much because it was in the first stages an authoritarian regime. And so they enforced it. So they enforced the policies, but they were clear policies about industrialization, and they were directed. They were very much directed policies. Also, the government had control of finance and could direct finance to wherever it thought it was needed. Also, there were controls over labor in this early stage. And so it started, though, as well with relatively high levels of education. That had happened immediately after the war, the Korean War. A lot of money poured into that. So you had educational levels were quite high, certainly high enough for industrialization and the sort of the mobilization of a population. Also, it was mobilized to industrialize rather than to focus on rural development. That came a little bit later with the rural development program, but there was much rural urban migration to the cities. The jobs were there because this is where it was going to be. But it's policy. Now, the developmental state, the industrialization carried on after the authoritarian period. So you get to the end of the authoritarian period at the end of the sort of towards the end of the 1980s, and you have democratization there. There was more and more objection from people, the community, demonstrations, strikes, you name it, all happening. But they still managed to carry on with high levels of growth and also with sort of diversification into new ventures. In South Korea, they've been successful in diversifying. They've been very successful as well in having a policy in which you upgrade your production. That is, you don't just stay assembling things, you don't just stay with simple industries. What you do is you move up a level in the production level. So if you look back in the manufacturing in South Korea, early on, what they focused on was a lot of basic things, and also easy to do things like textiles as well, and then moved up in production to, you started getting more complicated and engineering things, and eventually now they have, they're at the forefront of many industries. So culture plays a role in Korea, perhaps, but it's look at the policy frameworks of government and look at the commitment to economic development, look in the past at least to control over investment as well. So that's what the first thing I would say about the tiger countries. Second thing about planning being political. Okay, if we go on this, you can say planning is a profession. So we have a profession of planners, but the acts of planning which are undertaken don't only involve planners. People come and try to influence what goes into the plans, because plans are about decision making. How do you make decisions? And decisions, people want decisions to go in particular ways. People who have plantations, people who are small farmers, people who are in labor unions, people who are industrialists, people who whatever, they have interests in the way in which policy goes. So they try to influence policy which planning, which concerns them. They try to influence what goes into the plan and how the plan will be implemented. So what you find are political behaviors, behaviors like forming coalitions, behaviors like supporting certain politicians, supporting certain decision makers, putting pressure here. So that's what I mean by planning is highly political. It's that how do you end up with a particular decision? Because if you look at planning as decision making, you'll see that there is a lot of politics in it. And it's the same with an organization, any organization you're in. I mean, my life in universities, it's politics everywhere. In what's the new plan going to be? How does my department fit in it? How does my school fit in it? How am I going to sort of get the resources which I need? How am I going to influence the plan so that we're looked after? And so I then engage in politics. I engage in pressure. I engage in alignments, going coalitions. So that's what I meant by planning being political. Now, the third question on, well, adaptive planning, or perhaps better, that plans always changing. Here, it's a bit, to use an English expression, a bit between the devil and the deep blue sea. It's sort of, there's two extremes here. Now, on the one hand, I would say adaptive planning is good and is the way one should go, because as we heard from Septaliana from Bapanas, that of course you've got a major shock, for instance, COVID-19. I mean, you can't go on, business isn't as usual, so you can't go on like that. Now, the question would come back, but on the other hand, so there you can see, you've got to adapt, and adapt very radically. However, if you've got in a period of relative stability and plans are changing all the time, then you may have problems. And this goes back to my previous answer about this may well reflect the politics which is going on in planning, and people trying to influence what the plan actually is. So I sort of should say I'm a supporter of adaptive planning and a realist, that you don't, because you certainly don't want to go back to what we called blueprint planning in the past. Often the national development plans were blueprint plans, which is here's the plan, and now we just follow it. Even if the environment is changing around us, we just follow it blindly because it says so in the plan, so we're going to do that. That's not good. So you don't want that. So you always want the capacity to adapt, but it has to be an informed capacity in that you can justify why you're adapting, because it will bring better outputs and better outcomes. So that's your justification. And that's what should be seen as why you change. But you shouldn't change it for the sake of changing. No, not really. Okay, thanks.
Very interesting comments from Prof Mark Turner. I believe he has answered the questions from Saskia. So culture might influence, but the most important thing is to create a clear policy directions and framework that will create more stable conditions for labor incentive, relative education, and also she also mentions about the political aspects that create situations where politicians influence decisions for the planners. And Bu Isna, Prof Mark Turner has stated that he's still supporting the adaptive planning because he mentions about the blueprint of planning that is always rigid and it cannot be changed flexibly. So maybe I will move to Ina about the questions in regards to SMEs. Danso asking about SMEs and maybe some comments about the adaptive planning from the government that always changing and somehow inconsistent about what the people should do, whether mudik or not. And suddenly now there is also a policy that called every civil servants to go back to work and adapt to the new normal.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mas Agi, yeah? Mas Agi. Okay, Dasso's questions about, especially for Surabaya, I would like to reiterate that the approach in this COVID-19, managing and mitigating the COVID-19 impacts for the central government is following the decentralization, which is the central government focuses on certain aspect of the mitigation or the management, but the local areas are also expected to handle it as well, because there's lots of reasons. For example, the limited budget that the national government have, because with decentralization we know that local areas have funding or have budgets as well. So the central government only have a certain aspect of budgeting. So like what I explained in my last slide, although there is a packages from the central government, for example, to this is just one example, and I don't really know all of them because it's not part of what I work at currently. But for example, to decrease the loans payment for local businesses, or to provide capital stimulus to local businesses. But what we need to underline is that the local government is expected to facilitate the local small enterprises or restaurants or anything in the local area. Like, for example, they can provide an online platform from them to still sell their products. I will take one example from DKI Jakarta, because I live there, so I know, like, I also shop online for food from restaurants. They actually have made a platform specifically for their businesses, and they also have this cooperation between local businesses and the government on how to handle the COVID-19. But for Surabaya, I don't really know specifically, but those are the examples that the local government are full in charge of. So that is what the central government is expected expecting from the local government. You know your area more, you know your people more than the central government. That is the basic basic understanding of decentralization. That's why we did decentralization, because central everything is just not working anymore, and central government just don't know the local area more than the local area know themselves. So I don't know if it answers your question specifically, because you asked what kind of packages, but that's how the mechanism of this in facing the COVID-19 is right now, that the central government has a portion of their roles, but we really expect that the local government to step up and do their job in the local areas as well. And I would like to say something a bit about the political aspect. I really agree with Professor Turner. Let's not limit ourselves with the definition of politics, because politics is very wide. In the process of planning, from the first time we make the planning document, we need to adhere to the vision and mission of the elected politically of the head of the local area or of the president. So that's already political. And the process of them making the vision and mission is not detached of other networks or other development stakeholders that have their wants and have their needs. So as a planning, as a bureaucrat, and as an institution with a technocratic process, we still need to look at the aspects of politics. So that's what I think in the practicing aspect, that's what it consists of. The second is, for example, after we do the planning policies, we need to attach budgets to them, right? And the budgeting process is a very political process, because the DPR, the local politicians, are actually the ones that also determine about the budget. So planning policies are nothing without budgets attached to them. It's just going to be beautiful words. So that's also a political process. And I want to also comment on Ibu Isna. Is that correct? The third.
Yes.
Yeah. I also agree with Professor Turner and back up the adaptive planning. But I know what you mean, where you think that ad hoc policies are planning. It is not. If you read the planning documents, changes before the COVID-19, changes are rarely done. And when changes occur, it's about adjusting the targets more than adjusting the policies or the planning policies. So if you read our previous documents, it rarely changes. But I cannot say with the ad hoc policies, because that has more of a political flavor to it compared to the technocratic planning process. And what we usually do in Bappenas, if there's an ad hoc decision, suddenly there is a directive from the president that, oh, I want, this is just an example, I want this road changed from Kalimantan to Sulawesi. So that is also something that planners need to adjust to, but what we usually do is that we compromise. From my perspective, from the regional development unit, we really want local areas to succeed, and we are very committed to making local areas developed, especially like since we still have least developed regions and border regions that are not developed compared to their other counterparts in Java or Sumatra. So we always argue that, you know, we cannot compromise. If it's an important area for us, we cannot compromise this to change. But if we can still compromise, because we have an annual plan, we usually try to still do the policy or execute the planning, but we shift it to another year, or we can, if we have the budget, we can shift the budgets around. So, and ad hoc planning, I don't know if it might be bad, but it's something that we cannot avoid yet. It's part of the policy process, and if you read a lot of theories on it, how, for example, governance theories where networks are moving the decision makings, we need to look into it more, how those networks work. And for the planning system itself, Indonesian planning, really, we rarely change, unless COVID-19. We change everything in COVID-19, the budgets and everything. But before, we rarely really change. So you're a student? Are you a student or?
I'm lecturer.
Oh, sorry. So if you look at theories, how this process of planning is, because in theories, planning is very clean and very structured, and as Dasso said, how is it political? But it is, and that's the reality of it. And as an ideal, if we want to think ideally, how can we still achieve our targets, and how can we still work for the public, but with these conditions? That's the adaptive part, being able to still do the basic planning, but adapting to this political ad hoc changes is also, I think, a form of adaptive planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bu Ida. That's a very insightful from the inside of the government. I think we should invite more practitioners to our class, Wika, yeah? So we got many perspectives, not only from the theoretical perspective, but also from practical like this. Okay, yeah. I believe I want to say hello to some of our colleagues from Malaysia. Like, for example, Dr. Junaida and Dr. Molly. I believe we also confirms that Dr. Junaida wanted to share something about policy responses in COVID-19 in Malaysia. Maybe this is a very good opportunity for us to share our knowledge to our country. Maybe
so instead of having case study of Bhutan and Indonesia, we also have Malaysia here. So thank you, Dr. Junaida.
No, actually, this is Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Okay, my name is Junaida Ismail. Actually, I just getting these informations just a few minutes. Okay, so I just give sharing some of the initiative has been done by our Prime Minister. Okay. Regarding the COVID-19, how to combat the COVID-19, I think the application is similar with the rest of the country, which is we are implementing the social distance. We're closing some of the, totally closing the schools, and then related to the university also, we close the university, but we're still implementing the work from home, which is all the students can come out with their own study or lessons through the online distance learning. So I think everybody in Malaysia trigger and struggles to to using the ODL, because I think this is the new normals to everyone, because previously we're using the face-to-face meeting during our classes. That is, we consider implementations has been done through the social to the educations. But while we were referring to the what we call the economy, to the SME, for example, our government, we are luckily, because our government, they are trying to give several numbers of fund, okay, which is this kind of the fund to helping for the social development. Is not only for the individual, but is giving to the SME, small medium enterprise. For example, there are sums of fund given, at least 10 billion, to helping this kind of the SME to make sure there is a transactions should be done, because the main concerns of our our government is related to the unemployment affected during this kind of the COVID-19. Because I believe there is some of the research has been done from Dr. Aziza, if I don't mistaken. They're estimating, the estimations is almost 4% of the employees in Malaysia tendency to be change their status from employed to be unemployed. 4%, which is for the Malaysia, we consider this is the biggest numbers if this unemployment done, okay, by this particular SME or maybe industry. So that's why there's a lot of the fund given by our management, our government, to make sure to ensuring there is no total number of terminations employees can be reduced or maybe can be avoided. And then what actually the most important in Malaysia implementation during the COVID-19 policy is regarding the moratorium. Okay, which is Malaysia implement the moratorium for those who have a loan, which is these kinds of the loan can be hold in terms of the repayment for the 6 months. Okay, this is implemented by governments of Malaysia. So the government have a good connections with the Bank Negara Malaysia, our main treasury, which is they have a good discussions, which is every single of the people to make sure they have a money. So the moratorium has been implemented for the 6 months starting 1st March until September. So now everybody have their own extra money in hands, even though we cannot go for shopping because all the mall is closed. So I think this is actually the good approaches given by the government to ensuring or maybe to make sure every single of people in Malaysia is still calm. Okay, they are not really stressed. Okay, during the process of combat the COVID-19. Partials of that for the fiscal policy that I can highlight here is regarding the one-off payment given by our management, by our government, to every single to the B40 individual, which is B40 income classification B40, which is for those who are having income below than 3,000 and above. They will get one-off payment 1,600 Malaysia. And then for those who have income more than 5,000 and 8,000 M40 classification, government give them 1,000. Okay, as we consider as a one-off payment. Okay, so this is we consider another initiative, or maybe we consider as another fiscal policy that implemented by the Malaysia's government to ensure every single of the people they are happy during the process of restrictions movement or the RMO, because currently in Malaysia we implementing the RMO within for the 4 phases, 4 phase, which is we starting the RMO during 18 March. That is the first phases, and then now we are under phase number 4, which is starting 29 April until 12 May. Okay. Okay, I think that's all from the Malaysia perspective. Sorry, Dr. Sulika, because this is the suddenly request. Okay, so I didn't prepare very well. But overall, that is actually the ideas from Malaysia's implementations during to combat the COVID-19. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for the insight from Malaysia, Dr. Junaida. I believe our speaker, Bu Lia, has another meeting to go, so she will say goodbye to everyone.
Yes, sorry, very sorry, but I need to leave the meeting, this discussion early, and I hope we can have more discussions in the future. And good luck for everyone. Thank you, Professor Turner. Thank you, Mbak Ika. Thank you, Mas Agi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bu Lia.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay. Maybe is there any questions from the participants? Yes, Saskia.
All right. Right, thank you. So this is my second question. I think Bu Septa's remarks in regards to the strength of decentralized capacity during this COVID crisis is very interesting. And my second question is actually to Professor Turner. Is related to the emerging debates surrounding the strength and the weaknesses of different government arrangements in response to this crisis between centralization and decentralization. Because some people argue that strong centralized capacity might result in a more effective strategy, while the others argue the opposite is true. So in your experience, Professor, are there any sorts of arrangements that could facilitate the best of both worlds, particularly during this crisis? And yeah, the thing about Malaysia is also, I think what is interesting about Malaysia is the country has the highest number of recovered cases in the Southeast Asia. So yeah, that's very remarkable. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Junaida as well.
Thank you. Is there any questions left? Or maybe also some points that I want to ask to you, Prof. Turner, about whether the more decentralized a country is, the more difficult to handle such crisis. For example, if we look at the United States right now, they have the biggest death rate in the world. I think it's now more than 100,000 because some of the federal states leaders tend to be more like anti-lockdown. And there is also some movements from the people that are anti-lockdowns. So people coming to the streets, they say, my body, my rules, and they can go anywhere they like. So do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, I can give you a few comments on both of these questions on decentralization versus centralization. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, but I think that you have to look at each case on its own, because we'll take the American example. An American is a federal state, like in fact Malaysia, like in fact Australia, but the federal arrangements are somewhat different in each of these countries in the degree of power and authorities that are delegated to the different states. Now, we have one which is more decentralized than the Malaysian Federation, but we have had a great deal of success. The implementation of policies on COVID-19 in Australia, we have a national body and a national government, and then a national expert advisory panel, and they provide advice and direction. But it is up to the states as to how they actually implement this. And so what you have got is variations over time between the different states and territories. This has proved to be quite successful. So this would suggest that maybe it's not decentralization as such, in that you can't make a simple statement saying the more decentralized, the less sort of effective it's going to be. The question is, how effective are your decentralized governments? What capacity do they have? What processes can they do? How quickly can they react? So you have to ask these things. For instance, I live, as you know, in Canberra. We haven't had a COVID case for 13 days now. In Australia in general, we've only had 98 deaths. I mean, this is a remarkable achievement. And so what this goes down to, in my opinion, is the combination of state policy and national policy and working together. There's been occasionally some frictions, but they haven't been very many. In the United States, which is an interesting case, one has to ask one major question: what was the degree of preparedness, and how fast did national government react? Well, this, of course, all depends on who you listen to. If you listen to the president, he will say, we were sort of great, we did this, that, and the other. If you listen to some other voices, they will say, well, no, you didn't react properly, you didn't react fast enough. And of course, you have situations about what do you actually need in terms of resources. So that. Now, if you want to take a real success story in in Southeast Asia, then it's Vietnam which you have to look at. Vietnam has been extraordinarily successful in combating COVID-19, and one can say there you've got a centralized government in large part. So you've got strong levels of centralization, but you do have decentralized or rather more deconcentrated government as well. So with that, what you do have to look at in Vietnam is the swiftness with which they introduced their policies, the ability they had to get the people actually behind them, because all the reports I've seen are very popular support, but they move very fast, very decisively to do things. Whereas my personal view is that in America, it moved far too slowly and then was far too underprepared to deal with it. And of course, then you have sort of strange things about people saying freedom or COVID or all of this. So you get into strange politics, which perhaps in some of our societies and our political systems, we don't have. So I don't think there's a hard and fast answer. I will, one final comment on this. Decentralization offers problems, but it also offers opportunities. It offers problems in that coordination. How do you coordinate? Because, and of course, COVID-19 doesn't respect kabupaten boundaries, so, you know, or state boundaries. Although what they did in Australia, in large part, they just shut us off in our different states. Traveling internally was not possible. So we did that. So the COVID doesn't respect those boundaries. It'll nip across those. But so you've got coordination problems. So you must be coordinated in the response. But if you have the capacity, that's fine. With centralization, again, it's sort of the capacity is a sort of a big issue. The speed of response, and also you have things where you get denials. I mean, if you go to Brazil and Bolsonaro, who is the president, well, he is sort of adopting the line that, you know, it's still just a sort of little flu or something like that, despite the fact that the levels of infection have now gone right through the roof, as we say. It's very, very high. It's overtaken some. It's going to be very soon, you know, sort of second only to the USA. But what you have there is also a conflict between certain governors who want much more drastic policies and the national government under Bolsonaro, who wants it sort of all to open up. And it's notable there that you have had, I think, 2 health ministers have resigned, showing sort of dissension. So there's opportunities, there's threats in this. And so you have to look beyond just centralized, decentralized, to how policy works, how it's coordinated. Okay.
Very much, Prof Turner, for the astonishing answers. Are there any questions left from the participants? Okay, if there's, I think that's enough.
Everyone, you can also speak in Bahasa Indonesia if you have any question, and Aki will translate your question. Anyone, you can talk in Bahasa Indonesia too. Thanks.
Okay, maybe I think that's enough for today, Vika.
Sampai jam berapa sih?
At 12:30. 12:30.
Oh, we still have
Yes.
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Anyone want to have a comment or question? Anything? Maybe I would like to add just a little bit about the question, Prof. Turner. Yeah, there was also like assumption or argument that response to COVID-19 is work more to the more like authoritarian states rather than democratic states like USA or Indonesia, in which if with authoritarian or like order they can like force the citizen, while on the other hand democratic tend to have more authority, more coordination, which is so difficult to have like obedience from the citizen. Do you agree with that, or?
Yes, yes, I agree with that. That you've got sort of situations where in an authoritarian regime, if they decide that this is a major and imminent problem, threat of the highest order, they can take quite drastic action because there is in many ways a lack of debate about this, and therefore they can impose their will. Whereas, yes, democracies do have, relies on participation, and there may be sort of voices which challenge the chosen method that takes place. So yes, I think that they can do. On the other hand, there are some authoritarian regimes in Central Asia which have chosen basically to say, no, there isn't really any threat from this. We don't really have any, and have not done anything. So I'm not sure if you went around all of the world's authoritarian regimes, but certainly the evidence in Asia is that they can take immediate action. I don't know how successful or what it is in Laos. That's the only one. Vietnam has been highly successful and with popular support.
Okay, yeah. And yes, so we can like make like equivalency that authoritarian is more to centralistic planning, and while democracy, then you're gonna have a decentralization planning, yeah, Prof. And there is also there are always like strengths and weaknesses of both model, of course, and we might need to highlight that maybe clapping between the two, or like we have a combination of those two is the best way, or we can't do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that, yes. One thing I'd go back again to just on sort of policy business, that one of the things in a democratic polity is that it is very important for the government to persuade people that this is the right course of action to make. So therefore, you've got to have, and this is very important, you've got to have a clear course of action. So this is what we think you should do, and also back it up with expert advice. And this has been very much the case, I think, in New Zealand, which has got a very good record, and in Australia, where people have gone along and said, okay, yeah, this is correct. We will observe that social distancing. Yes, we won't do that in general. In general, this has been a great support. And the constant backing of it by experts in the field, the people who are on the advisory committee, the sort of chief of the health and the such like, doctors, professionals, specialists, experts who know about this, and we've gone along with that. I'd say that you can see, going the other way a bit with you, in the UK, it's been a much more modelled response in the UK to this. There was a statement by the Prime Minister a few days ago, which he seemed to contradict himself several times, and immediately on social media there were many posts, and especially of one very famous British comedian who did a takeoff of the Prime Minister, emphasizing this contradiction. And people don't want to hear those contradictions. They want a clear message, always do.
Yeah. You can summarize or... Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, so for tomorrow, I already sent a paper that is written by Prof Mark Turner and also two academics from Universitas Indonesia, Eko Prasojo and Rudiarto Sumarwono. So the tomorrow's topic is about the challenge of reforming big bureaucracy in Indonesia. I believe that today's participant exceeds from 100, which is unfortunate cannot join. But tomorrow I will try to do my best, so we will get maximum 300 people to join the discussion. So I think that's enough for today, Bu Ika. And thank you so much, Prof Turner, for the insightful materials and discussions. And I hope to see you tomorrow at 10 EM from Indonesia, yeah, and 1 PM in Australia. Okay.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed this. It's been very interesting, and thank you very much for directing affairs on this and helping me with the technology as well.
Okay.
Yes. Prof Mark Turner, can you please stay on the Zoom first before?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for the moderator. It was a great session with Prof Mark Turner. Hopefully, it benefits us all. And you may leave for now, and I hope to see you again next tomorrow and the day after. And also for Dr. Junaida from UITM Kedah and from Dr. Molly from UITM Mara in Seremban, and also Bapak Ibu semua dari setiap Bandung, dari Lambung Mangkurat, semuanya ya, terima kasih banyak sudah berpartisipasi, sudah join webinar ini. Semoga besok kita bisa bertemu lagi. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu.
If we can turn on the camera and take selfie. I will capture the screen. Yeah. Can everyone turn on the camera?
Mau ini ya, videonya ya.
Oh, anu baheula teh ya.
Ayo silakan Bapak Ibu, kita foto bersama.
Okay, I will take selfie from everyone.
Semua ini videonya bisa dinyalakan ya.
Okay, maybe some of us. Okay, let me check the picture ya. Okay, one. Okay, please turn on your camera. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay, once again.
Ada Ibu dari PSPA itu apa ya Ibu, kalau boleh tahu PSPA?
1, 2, 3. Okay.
Oh ya.
Berapa sih kamu? Masa gede ya? 5,
udah ya.
Sulika, Mas Agi.
Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you very much,
terima kasih
everyone.
Bu Isna.
See you tomorrow.
Salam buat teman-teman di Umsida ya, Bu Isna.
Sulika.
Ya. Junaida, thank you very much. Hope to see you tomorrow and the next in our webinar join meeting ya.
Insyaallah. Assalamualaikum.
Pak Takim, terima kasih banyak sudah hadir ya. Dan adik-adik mahasiswa semua, terima kasih ya. Ada alumni, ada adik S1, S2 di Departemen AM.
Oh, udah bisa. Tadi mau mobil. Mobilnya di mana?
Oke.
Salam dari Bandung.
Ya, terima kasih Bapak. Salam balik. Semoga besok bisa
juga.
join lagi ya Bapak.
Pengen nge-hang.
Allah.
Besok akan kuotanya akan ditambah. Bu Priska Dini dari Lambung Makurat ya, terima kasih juga.
Karena si Nani mau pakai waktu itu kan yang ori nggak yang ini yang nggak originalnya nggak ketemu. Di kepala dia kasih original yang ini si chargernya.
Saruan chargernya.
Tapi
Oke.
Lagi ini gimana berarti?
Ini Prof Mark Turner kenapa apa diminta di sini lagi itu gimana, Bu?
Yeah, I wanna speak to Prof Mark Turner for a while.
Oh, gitu ya. Ini langsung aja nggak apa-apa sih.
Oh ya Ibu. Ya, terima kasih ya Ibu dari perlindungan apa Bu?
Thank
Anak,
you.
perlindungan anak. Ya, tenang. Oke. Bu Leni, makasih ya udah hadir. Oke. Oke. Apa sih? Gak gelem. Oh, gak betul apa sih?
Prof Mark Turner and Wika, I will escort you to different room ya.
Oh, okay.
1 second. Okay. You should be in different room after this.
From your experience today,
Okay.
for your presentation today, it's great one.
Okay, this is a private room. I already booked you guys.
Susah itu tadi kok nggak keluar ya. I ask everyone to leave, but they like tend to stay in the chat in the room meeting. I think they don't want to leave you, Prof. Prof, once again, we would like to say thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For having this opportunity. Like Agi said, before it was planned to held after the Idul Fitri, but then you managed to do it soon, and it's in very short notice. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that, because our lecture is finished this week, so it's gonna be more effective if people still around, not on the holiday or exam period. So again, thank you very much. Yes, and Prof, could I ask you to sign the contract document? Yeah, just with digital signature.